Whole Man Academy. Because the world needs strong men. Whole Man Academy is changing the game for men around the world. It's for guys who want to live an epic life of fun and adventure, no matter what. We believe, deep down, all men want to go on their own hero's journey to becoming resilient, confident, fearless, and fulfilled. Listen in to be inspired by guys who don't settle for living a life of mediocrity. This is your call to action and call to adventure. Are you ready?
Okay, guys, usual reminder before we kick off, remember to subscribe to our game-changing weekly e-letter. Goes out to hundreds of men across the world on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Right, let's jump in. Okay, so this is the Whole Man Academy podcast, episode 120, last one before Christmas in theory. My guest today is James Hawes, author, speaker, psychotherapist, trainer, supervisor. The Secret Lives of Men is the book he has written and we're going to talk about. I'm really pleased to have you on because we've connected on LinkedIn and I've looked at a lot of your stuff and I think it's going to be a great message and a great podcast. But firstly, we'll start off with how are you and where are you?
Brilliant. Well, thanks for having me on, Anthony. So I'm based in Nottingham in the UK. I don't range from here. I basically was born in Suffolk, but I'm good. I'm just having a bit of more of a relaxing day. So I'm kind of looking forward to bits and bobs I've got to do today.
Now, I mean, we talked about this just before we press record, but the rise of people either deciding to or kind of being forced to work from home and the issues that can face for men. But I just wanted to start off with, because I thought your stories are interesting because although many years ago you started down this path, when you first kind of in your career, you were qualified as a carpenter. And I wondered for you, at what age were you a carpenter and how would you have thought when you were a carpenter, if someone had said that many years later you'd be a author, speaker, psychotherapist, trainer? I just wondered what you would have said as the young man back then.
I think I would have had no idea or no inclination, not a thought in my head about the possibility. Didn't even know what a counsellor or psychotherapist was at that point. So no idea. I mean, I left school at 16. My mum, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. My mum basically said, you got to get a job. Come from quite a poor working class background. She got me a job into a chicken factory. So I was kind of doing that for about 6 weeks, good money in those days, actually, bizarrely. But then I got an apprenticeship to become a carpenter, and my salary was halved. So that was the kind of, I thought I've got to get out of this factory, and I wasn't really thinking, well, do I want to become a carpenter? But where I lived, there wasn't that many options, not in my way of thinking at that point. So, and then the stories evolved to where I've got to now.
I think it's important always for guys. I mean, we're up to 120 podcasts. So I've, spoke to guys from all across the world and all different topics. And I love hearing their stories because, most of the men are over, let's just say 35, 40. And often where they are now is they had no idea they would be where they are at this point, which reminds you, we all go through phases where you think maybe you're stuck in a rut and you're sleepwalking through life and you can't see, obviously, 5 years, 10 years into the future and be doing something that's, a bit more fulfilling. Sure. And I wondered, we're going to talk a lot about the book, about barriers, landscape for men, but doing let's call it being the therapist side of it. I wondered for you, how do you keep your own kind of, when I say barriers up, I mean, because if you're hearing, sometimes traumatic things from people and, their innermost thoughts, it must be hard, I'm guessing here, but for you also to kind of compartmentalize that and then go home and be like, I'm home, how are you doing?
Sure, yeah, that's a very, very good question. And I think it's really important in terms of the psychotherapy world that we have kind of boundaries and ways of practicing that are really important. So one of those things would be we would have to have ethically and professionally supervision, which right. means that we kind of have to think at least every month, once, twice, however many times, to kind of almost download some of this stuff onto another person to talk about the things that we're struggling. So there's that kind of, I can't hold all of this. Yeah. And then, of course, there's that other part that, personally, you have to kind of be really secure in your boundaries and what you do. I mean, writing notes won't be one of those things. You're right, I'm just going to download this on a piece of paper. Or it may be, you're having your own therapy. A lot of counsellors still are in therapy, and that can be quite important. Or other support measures. I've been part of a men's group for many years, so that's kind of thing that I would use that in terms of talking about what's going on for me and trying to work out kind of what I'm holding in my body, perhaps, and what I'm unaware of, and trying to work some of that out. And the other side, physicality, I mean, move. That's that. And unfortunately, I've not been moving too much in the last few months because I ruptured my Achilles. So which usually I'm on a bike, I'm outdoors doing DIY, or I'm really into wood, still, but logs, kind of stacking and storing, as I say, so all of that kind of stuff I think is really important, just to kind of think, right, I've got to get out of my head and get into my body, as it were.
And you said the physical side of it, it's been such a common theme. If you had to take all the episodes and pick just a few common things, one of them is like getting out in nature and away from tech and moving your body to really kind of just help you. I don't know. I know we're going to use the word decompress because a lot of guys maybe don't give themselves that opportunity. But I wanted to pick up on, you said about like men's groups. We're recording this off the back of last night was our latest Whole Man Academy dinner. And we originally had, I think, 15 or 16 guys. As always, things happen. People have to pull out for reasons. But I think we had 12 guys at the dinner. And a lot of them said, because we live out in the countryside, that none of the guys, or only a few of them, lived around here. So when you move here, you basically haven't got any friends. And if you're then, for some of them, working from home, etc., you're not getting that chance to have the laugh, the interaction, the banter, whatever you want to call it. One of the guys, I mean, several of them, one had worked in Formula One, one had worked for Aston Martin, and he's just retired. And he said, I really miss that thing of being in and just spending time with other guys, having a laugh. And I wondered for you, at what point did you start realizing not just the value of men's groups, but just kind of actively getting around them, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and a massive issue, I think, for men in terms of friendship, loneliness, isolation, men struggling to make friends and keep friends, certainly after 35. I think that's something that is fairly common, and it sounds like you're very aware of. I think when I trained in my therapy course, one of the big things about therapy is that, and still I think this is true today on most courses, is that it's mainly populated by women. So there's probably one or two men in a course in my day. That was kind of over 20 years ago. And in my head, the only thing I had thought as soon as I'd finished my therapy course was, I want to work with men. And I want to create a men's group. I need men in terms of being able to connect with them at different levels, but certainly the men's groups we're talking about, it's kind of very much about trying to develop our emotional fitness, if you like. And so at that level, and have friends at that point. So I was very clear about that, and that was kind of, I suppose I was training in my mid to late 30s. So that's kind of that crucial classic time, really, ultimately.
And you just said it there, like being in the mid 30s, because I've been asked before about the Whole Man Academy, and you can't try and appeal to everybody, because there's the old try and appeal to everybody, you appeal to nobody. And in fact, I remember a couple of months ago, one of the guys contacted me on, I think it was Instagram, doesn't matter, and said, you talk a lot about it's kind of men over 35. And I was like, that's maybe because in your 20s, I'm not saying that nobody in their 20s has issues at all, but I can understand what it's like to be a father, to go through different careers, that kind of stuff, that in my 20s, I didn't see those issues arising. And I just wonder if we developed this question of like, what are you seeing as the landscape for men at the moment? Because I think there's a lot of confusion around, and priorities are shifting, expectations are shifting.
Can you just say a little bit more about what you mean by that landscape? I mean, it's a really interesting concept, but can you say a little bit more?
Yeah, and I think the big discussion last night was again on the working from home, and the blurred lines also between. I mean, we laughed because, and I have it as well, where you're trying to compartmentalize being maybe dad, at home, and then the man at work who then might come out of his office and isn't having the interaction and isn't getting a chance to decompress.
Yeah, well, I think in terms of I think it's really interesting in terms of, like, say, let's just take the working from home, because you've already mentioned that sense of kind of isolation. There's a lot of, we've learned, haven't we, in terms of working from home or
Mm.
hybrid kind of idea, that actually there's a lot of freedom. That we get a lot back, in terms of lack of, don't have to commute.
Yeah.
We've got more time, more connection with the family. So there's some real positives here. But I think the things that we miss is, and you use the word decompress.
Mm.
I think it's a really interesting thing in terms of even the transition from work to home, and I think that's and I in my psychotherapy practice, I think that's a really useful way of, because if we're not aware of what we're carrying from work, and we can just be upstairs or downstairs in our office, then go into the family, and we've not actually processed that stuff. It's not, we've not moved it, and
Yeah.
we can almost then easily project or dump it on the family. And I think that transition, whether we cycle, train, car, whatever we're doing, I often say, look, for men, use that time to think, look, leave your stuff at work and work that through, what you need, and then when you're ready,
Yeah.
you're moving back into another space, and you'll kind of think, okay, this is home, and
Mm.
I'm not carrying that stuff now. It's not easy. Just, we can't just split. It's not like that, but at least we're becoming aware of, I need to move and through this transition into another space. And so I think that is a problem. I mean, it's interesting, even with online therapy, there's lots of fors and against. I mean, I know that in my practice, lots of men basically want to be in the room. They want to be face to face.
Yep.
Now, I do some Zoom still, but most men, I would say, want to be in the room. They want to sit down with you. They want to
Mm.
be face to face. They want to get out. They want to
Yeah.
move. And I think that's really interesting, and I equally like it. And I think the interesting thing with therapy is that the journey, the journey to the place, and what goes on there, the waiting for your session, and then the session, then the journey back. Now, if we're doing this on a screen, we can think, oh, I'm listening to you, or you're having a therapy session. You're then right. I've got to sort the kids out as soon as
Click.
now. So you got no space for that kind of
Yeah.
decompress or reflect or transition.
And do you know what you've just said? I mean, it was a couple of podcasts ago. We talked about, even with, let's say, personal development. I've been to a lot of the big events in the US and this country, and of course, a lot of them got moved online. But there is no substitute for, and as you say, be it therapy or an immersive experience, instead of just sitting at a screen. And I realize now, so many men do spend a lot of time looking at a computer screen, and then
Yes, of course.
just looking at that. And I wondered, for you, what's your kind of relationship been like with social media? Because for a lot of guys, I mean, to state the obvious, you and I didn't grow up with it, thankfully, and most of the guys last night said the same. But the guys in their, let's say, 30s and younger are having to kind of navigate the, comparing themselves on social media to things, and of course there's some good stuff out there on men's health and men's mindset as well. So I want to, for you, what's your thoughts on or I should change that question, the guys that you work with, what's their kind of feedback on the thoughts of social media and the impact of it?
And are you saying in terms of the way that we use it, or the amount of time we use it, or what we're hearing and what we're listening to from kind of social media?
Probably all of those, actually, because they're all such big things, aren't they? Because again, it's like some people say, I don't use it that much, but then it's like, well, what are you using it for? So you can pick any of those, really.
Yeah. Well, I think let's just say what happens for me personally. I mean, I kind of don't like it, but I find it it's the thing, isn't it? In terms of, we can talk with young people and children who are kind of natives in this area. They've just grown up with it, and for me, I find I can waste a lot of time. I can, in terms of scrolling, and it's a real difficult discipline that I'm having to work with, and I try and just leave my phone alone. I have a dog walk. I absolutely of a discipline. No, I don't take my phone at all. And I find that really useful. Just think, oh, just headspace here, just with my dog in nature. And so, and I've got also, so I'm trying to leave it alone. And that's why I like DIY or stuff, because I'm thinking, I want to get my hands. I don't want that. I just want it. And so I think there's a real discipline there. And I know also that when I engage in social media, like, posts that, around men or masculinity, I again can find myself, so, you can spend a long time thinking, reflecting, and then I'm going to put a really good or clever comment back here, and bit of ego going in there, all that kind of stuff. And I just think, really, does it really matter? That doesn't matter to them. It wastes so much time with very little stuff coming back, so I've got an ambivalent relationship with it. I think it's a constant discipline, and all the young people I work with, who are kind of born with this stuff, they're also having to work out a discipline of, like, it becomes it's natural to them, but what is it doing to me, and how can I learn to put it down? So some clients I work with, couples especially, kind of looking at kind of screens in the bedroom. If we're talking about kind of intimacy, say, well, what? And again, it's so natural to have screens in the bedroom. Might be a big screen, might be little screens. And one of my views is that, and this feels like an old school stuff. Well, look, just leave screens out of your bedroom. If we're talking about sleep, and we're talking about intimacy, not that just sex is in the bedroom, as it were, but the sense of, this sleep is almost sacred, and we need to look after it. And actually, let's give ourselves space from the screens, which is a kind of but so many couples, be in bed and they'll be on their screens. And you think, well, there's just these disciplines that leave your phone alone, leave it in a drawer somewhere or something. I have a cover on mine, which I kind of, people say, oh, what you got a cover on your phone for? Well, one of the things is that I can't see it flashing up. If it's that, so I just can't see anything happening, and I've turned off most of the beeping and all that kind of stuff, just so it's not kind of mastering me, as it were.
Well, you said there about sleep, A, to state the obvious, being important, but B, we covered it we've got an online, call it Energy Protocol course, and we try and cover mindset, fitness, sleep, nutrition, all the things that roll together. But one of the things was trying to create let's call it a peaceful Zen-like environment in your bedroom, and having notifications and stuff. But it was a guy I was listening to the other day, who, and I've done it myself, where you find yourself waking up and the first thing you do is, like, especially because often people's alarm will be on their phone as well. And we're a big one for trying to get some kind of old school alarm clock, because not many people have the luxury of just waking up whenever they want to. That's in an ideal world. But I wondered for you, I saw the comment or the quote by Brian Moore that you had on your website, which is, it is possible to come across as bullish, argumentative, forceful, mouthy, and yet be absolutely crippled emotionally. And I would link that back to, it makes you wonder in years to come what people's reliance on mobile phones and just scrolling, how that will affect people. Because we spoke last night, so many people can be keyboard warriors, where they're very, we can all do it. I'm going to write this and this. But if you were sitting face to face, you probably wouldn't do it. And I wondered for you, with primarily the men you work with, do you see social media as one of the issues they come to you with, or is it just one of the many?
I would say I hardly ever, men in my therapy practice hardly ever talk about social media. Then equally, they never really talked about COVID, neither. People say, "Oh," and they didn't. I generally. So just staying on your point. It is an issue. And I think, but I think it's something about, it's a bit like, I'll flip it over here with young people and parents. I get a lot of parents talk to me about, young people using social media or gaming or stuff like that. And, and I know, in terms of the research, the hours that, it was only probably about 10 to 15 years ago where we were thinking 2 hours on social media on a screen was kind of too much. We're now talking about 5 to 6 hours a day would be absolutely normal. you know, so you can put in easily a 50 to 60-hour week just on screens for young people, and that's fairly normal, I think, for a lot of people. So for me, it's like, we're not going to stop it. It's going to take over some of our time. You know, it's a bit like, you know, going back to the past. Well, you know, when I was carpenter, for instance, or men with a newspaper. You know, it's just like, right, I'm opening my newspaper, you know, classically at home, your wife's talking to you, yeah, reading the paper. So it's I don't want to be an old codger. The idea of, look, things are developing. We're not gonna stop this. But so this comes down to kind of a discipline of how are we going to manage it. And I think I trust young people enough that they are going to work this out and say, yeah, if they've got time, they will use that. But equally, when I was a kid, well, I might have been playing out in the garden, I might have been in the den and stuff like that, which I think is all good stuff.
Yeah.
Again, we probably don't want to go there, but I think the kind of freestyle play for young people and children, there's a real loss there. And that's partly to do with culture and the fear factor within culture, and for over parenting. But I think there's a sense of, look, the world has changed. We've got to cope with it, but equally, we need, like anything, we need to create disciplines around this stuff, because it's not going to go away. I know there is some part of the culture going back to kind of the old, non-smartphones, which I've kind of considered, because I'm thinking, well, because the phone's there, this amazing computer in the palm of your hand, and why? Because it's really attractive, and it's a real way of pulling us out of the moment, isn't it?
Well, I think it's sometimes you don't realize. I mean, I've done it myself. I spoke ages ago about I call it like the circle of social media, where I could, I've got my own Instagram account, which I rarely use, but still people message on it. I've got the Whole Man Academy. You've got LinkedIn. You've got Facebook. I hate TikTok, and we had an account, but then I've got the podcast. We've got our own YouTube channel. You've got Spotify. So you could quite easily look at one, look at the next, look at this, then maybe Twitter, and go around. And when you finish all those, you're like, oh, have another look again. And like you say, you realize how many hours you've wasted. Yeah. But that goes back to, so a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed a guy called Neil Kramer, and he said he thought a lot of the issue of men was about men drifting without a compass. And I just wonder if social media isn't one of the issues, if you had to pick the top couple of things that a guy, we could say women as well, it doesn't really matter, because a lot of the time they might be similar. What are the main things that people are struggling with at the moment?
Well, I think in terms of my work with men, so probably 98% of my clients are male. Right. Now, I do advertise myself a lot in terms of anger. So there's no doubt that a lot of my work with men is around anger. And when we talk about anger, particularly rage. So I'm really interested in kind of defining anger. And also, I just want to say here that anger gets a bad rap. I think all emotions are healthy, but when we think about anger, we think of it being an unhealthy thing, and we classically go to aggressiveness. But there's a lot more to that. So anger is definitely something I deal with, and that's partly the stuff that I'll work with in terms of around man and masculinity. And I think relationships and communication, the classic stuff, I suppose. But that's kind of ties into my work around emotional fitness, and kind of helping men to kind of develop in that way.
I think it's such an expansive topic, because the words anger or rage, and because like you said, often people can feel like that you shouldn't feel those things, but for me, I sometimes feel that, where you're pissed off because something's happened or something's gone wrong or what have you. And I guess then for you, where do you take that conversation? Because I know you're not trying to fix them. Is it then helping them have better understanding of their thoughts and feelings, if that can try and sum it up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, look, I suppose when we talk about anger with men, I feel that it's often men's default emotion. It's almost like, if we talk about masculinity, it's the strong emotion, it's the powerful emotion, it's the emotion we're allowed. Right early on, boys will be boys. We expect boys to fight. That's what they'll do. So there's almost like it's sanctioned. You know, men and there's a big link here with sanctions with sport as well, and what kind of emotions we sanction within the sporting world, and why sport is so important for men, I think. So I think in terms of the work that I would do is to try and help men to understand their anger. What is it, and is it the right emotion? Because if it is our default, are we then seeing anger as a kind of conduit for other emotions that they may not feel they can express or have not learned how to express?
Yeah.
But just in terms of just rage, which is the one that I work with most, my view about rage is that it's the most powerful emotion. And again, there's a real positive thing about rage. You know, it's instinctual. It'll get us out of a lot of trouble without violence. You know, without abuse as well. But so there's a real healthy side to this. But often we hear about the unhealthy, and I suppose what I say about rage, it's got very little to do with the present and everything to do with the past. So when we hear rage, people talk about rage, it's almost like, you know, the red mist descends. It's like, you know, it wasn't me. It was like an alien. It's something that took over me. You know, I wasn't there. You know, it was almost trance-like.
Yes.
So this idea for me is like, you know, going from 0 to 100 in a nanosecond. Rationally, there's nothing rational about that, like road rage. It's bonkers. There's nothing. But if we put it into a psychological idea, then there's this sense of the look. If we say it's got everything to do with the past, it's almost like, what am I hearing? And I think there's a real link between rage and unhealthy or toxic shame, which makes us feel smaller. We go lower. And then from that small place, we go into, a bit like the Hulk, go into this huge bit. And it's go on the attack, because actually we feel massively under threat at that point. And I think having a psychoeducational understanding of what is going on there, as in, I think often the trigger for rage is being belittled, patronized, you know, treated like a child, ignored, disrespected. Anything like that, I'm invisible. Anything that says, actually, you're treating me like shit, and I need to actually assert myself. But in the assertion, it goes into harming often other people and, of course, self.
There's some great points there, and you flipped it back to, as you were saying, I was thinking, you know, we're not taught any of this as we're growing up, to state the obvious. So for most men, you know, me as much as anybody else, I'd never thought about any of that stuff probably till I was in my mid-30s and started to look around a bit more. And going back to let's say, kids and young men, I just wondered, you know, where do you even start with trying to help? Because you're not necessarily trying to have children go to therapy, because you want it to be that it's just part of growing up. I just wondered, where do you start with helping and it doesn't have to be a child, but, you know, a young guy kind of channel his rage, if that's the best thing? Because you're not trying to stop it. You're saying it's a reaction and it's a feeling, what have you, but it's about, well, what do you do with it? You know, do you punch someone, or do you channel it in hopefully a better way?
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, I suppose the way I work with rage is that, number one, that we need to, I call it the emergency brake. We need to pull on a brake, because we don't ultimately, the first thing is, we don't want to do damage to other people or ourselves. And so I think there is a real discipline and work to do there, and working out the triggers and what's going on in our body. And I often say, look, rage, out of all of the anger kind of modes, if you like, is embodied. That's why, you know, we're lost. You know, we're not there, and we're doing things that we wouldn't kind of think of. So the work of being in our body is really important. I often say, look, men work their bodies, they beat their bodies, they build their bodies, they shred their bodies. Very few men listen to their bodies. So that kind of reconnection with body is really important. I think women have definitely got an advantage over us about the body, because, well, frankly, they bleed. So they're in tune with their body, and they in terms of if they become mothers, you know, they endure that kind of pain. Us as men, we just kind of get a bit fatter, you know, nothing changes to our bodies really, you know, unless you're actively trying to build them with muscle and stuff like that. So I think in terms of young people and rage, my view is that, number one, I've done rage. I've absolutely raged in
Yeah.
my life, and it's scary for me. It's scary for the people around.
What
And
makes you rage? What would be, because I was going to say, a lot of the guys listening to this will be, I'm going to say young dads, but fathers. And I would say for myself, until I had kids, I can't remember the last time I was in a rage, because I'm a pretty chilled out person, but kids are a totally different animal and there's no control of them. And sometimes they do stuff and it pisses you off or fucks something up and they don't get it and they just kind of laugh and you're like, and you feel it coming out and you're like, where's it come from?
Yeah.
What
Well,
would get you into a rage, or what did, maybe, not to say you wouldn't, but what kind of stuff would kind of, get that going?
yeah, well, I think you're right. You're spot on. Exactly when I raged as well, when my children were younger, and so I think it's quite a common thing. But I mean, actually, my first rage was when I was quite recently married to my wife, and well, it was a rage. It was a kind of primal scream. It was like, and this it came from a really long way behind me. It was definitely in the past, but and my poor wife, she think, what the fuck have I married here? What is this? Who is this? I had to go into therapy after that. I definitely did. This was the way before I was a therapist.
Yeah.
But I think that was to do with the mother. It was to do with the connection with mother, woman, and the kind of all the stuff that was within my relationship with my mother. So, and I think actually, most rage, yes, we talk about road rage and stuff like that, but most rage is in the home and to our intimates. It's to our wives or to our children. Now, why is that? Well, of course, because we're generally more real at home, aren't we? We show our full self because we know that we're loved and that they're not generally going to reject us. They're going to come back to us. So it feels safe to express that stuff. But you're absolutely right in terms of, I think, when we are taken on, as it were, by little people, in our heads we're thinking, hold on, I'm bigger. I would never treat my adult or parent perhaps like this, and when I was your age, I would have just, obeyed, as it were, perhaps.
Yes.
Or there's a sense of we go into when we don't get what we're wanting from our children, we go into that small place, and this is what I mean by the less than place of shame. So the idea, I feel small, and so I feel out of control, I feel powerless. But these things that men don't want to feel. We spent a lot of years trying to feel powerful, in control, strong, and so that's where I think rage to children and to our partners, often it's nearly always triggered by being patronized. Again, it goes to the small place. You're treating me like a child. You're thinking I don't know what I'm doing. You're seeing me as stupid, and so then it go erupts. So it's always, I think, rage in that that unhealthy rage is all to do with smallness, and because the masculine, the rules of being a man is all about big. It's being big. It's being powerful. It's being in control.
I think I laugh because again, I had these kind of conversation with, either friends or friends through the Whole Man Academy, or sometimes podcast guests after we've stopped recording, where you'll be chatting about something. And I said that a long time ago, throughout my early years, I was never a fighter. I was too busy chasing girls, to be honest. That was what I put my energy into, and that's what I was.
Lover.
That's it. That's what I was. That was my energy. But I always find it interesting with men's relationships with their fathers and mothers as well. But I've said plenty of times, you could say all of the mates of mine who always seem to get into fights or seem to have the most issues, all of them, I'm not saying it means that it's an absolute, but for all of those, was because they either didn't have a father figure around, or they did, and basically he didn't show them, he wasn't there for them very much. I just wondered, for you, what do you see as the effect on, because just because you've got a dad around, it doesn't mean it's necessarily good, because it depends what kind of person they are. And I wondered what your thoughts are on how important it is to have that father figure to guide you as a growing up as well.
Well, massive. I mean, in psychology, we talk about the wound of the father. There's the wound of the mother as well. So, which the concept means that kind of lack of, not enough. not enough good enough father.
Yeah.
Now, 95% of the men I've worked with individually and in groups would have a problem with their father. They're not, there's a lack of, there's a wound. So this is a really common thing. There's a chapter in my book about it as well. And so I often say, look, whether you knew your father, whether you lived with your father, whether your father is alive or dead, it doesn't matter. There's the relationship with the father, like the mother, is massively important. Yeah. And we learn a lot from our father. And what I think the big thing, if we are living with our father, what we learn about how to express emotions, or how not to express emotions. Because most men, I would say, most fathers, unfortunately, and I think, and we can talk about, is it changing or not? I think are ultimately sometimes physically isolated and nearly always emotionally isolated. And so what we learn from men, and I think this is a difficult message in terms of what we learn about emotions at that stage is we're looking up to our father as little boys and thinking, okay, what emotions do we see from him? We'll probably see anger. Yep. But do we see any tears? Do we see any sadness? Do we see any other emotions, anxiety and vulnerability? Do we see them? And probably not. And so what we learn is self-reliance. And so we learn that I've got to deal with these emotions inside, and I've got to rely on myself. Now, this self-reliance, in many ways, you could think, well, that's pretty good, it's pretty positive. And of course, we want people to be self-reliant. Yep. But when it comes to relationships, and often I think when couples get to me, one of the issues is self-reliance, because ultimately, if we rely totally on ourselves, we don't trust the other person. We don't open up to them, because I think we've learned I've got to deal with this stuff by myself. And that's where we could talk about, the man cave, the physical man cave, the psychological man cave, the idea of what we've learned how to manage our difficult emotions.
I realized we could do a 5-hour podcast on this, because, and it's funny because so many of the guys I talk to, you realize there's so much to unpack for men. And the other one was about, you said the word shame. And I think that's really interesting, because you just don't hit, to state the obvious, no, you don't hear people talking about shame and the effects of, as a child, if, and I probably can't put this very eloquently, but, I've noticed where sometimes you don't mean to, but we try to be very mindful of, when your child does something wrong, is not shaming them, or kind of, and it's a real tightrope, because sometimes you react to something. And I wondered then, if you brought the shame level into it, where do you start with guys if they're kind of talking to you or in the book, etc., about the issue of shame? Because I guess a lot of guys don't even realize maybe that they've got it inbuilt in them.
No, and shame, you're right. Even for us as men to be talking about shame, I think is quite rare. And I know that sometimes, I don't know if I always do bring it into the room, but men don't want to talk about it. I think ultimately, instinctively, we know shame. And it's because when Brené Brown has written a few books, and she's written a book on shame. She did some research with women on shame, and then she started to do some on men. And she said what men understand by shame is two things: weakness and failure. And these are the things that men don't want to go anywhere near. It's a bit like, men not saying those words of "I made a mistake" or "I'm sorry," the really difficult places. So we don't want to admit that actually we may have messed up or we made a mistake, because that would mean that I would go into shame. And I think, I talk in my book about the kind of shame cycle. But I do think if we don't get in touch with our internal shame, and I think there's a gender shame on men. And what I mean by that is the shaming on men is very different to the shaming on women. Women are generally shamed for their in terms of their looks, their size, their nurturing ability, those kind of things. And men, we're shamed just for being a man. So man up, what sort of man are you, man or mouse? Our masculinity, our view of men being a man is very slippery. And that's why I think we're constantly having to keep running and moving to make sure that I can be seen as a man. And that is exhausting. But that underneath that is the gender shaming of, well, you're really not much of a man, are you? And I think it's interesting as I talk about this, because I can get this shamed by other men, because I may not hold to their views of what their masculinity is, and they're almost like, well, you're not much of a man, are you? Do you know what I mean? And it's fascinating. Men use it, women use it, and so I think shame. If we're gonna grow as men, we have to do our work on shame and shame resilience.
And it's doing the work. And going back to a couple of podcasts ago, where you said, I think so many people, and I said it wrong when I said people are too busy. What I meant was people are too distracted by life and things to actually, to have these uncomfortable conversations, which is why, a lot of men you see, if you talk to them, they would probably just bury their head in the sand, but maybe they'd listen to a podcast because they can do it quietly instead of expressing it out in front. And it also comes back to, I mean, when I worked in the city, you might be on a broking floor, or primarily a broking floor with like 300 other men. So these conversations aren't being had at all. And it's hard for men to find the opportunities to even discuss this, if that makes sense. And I wondered for you, I know you'd written about like practical tips to build emotional muscle. And I always think for guys, the simpler the better, if that makes sense. And it's like, if you had to, I'm not saying you have to pick 3 of the best ones, but like 1 or 2 ideas, because if a guy's like, yeah, do you know what, I need to work on this stuff, but it's like, okay, well, where do I actually start?
Yeah, so I mean, when I talk about emotional muscle, it's kind of this emotional fitness program, a kind of 5K, couch to 5K kind of idea, and I think we as men, we are kind of generally behind because of what we've learned about masculinity and how to express our emotions. So for me, a key one, and I entitled in my book, I suppose, like feelings are like a foreign language. So it's almost like learning another language, and it's not just language, it's not just verbal, but it is with our body as well. So I very rarely ask men in my practice how they feel, because they'll probably say things like, okay, not bad, fine, all right, normal. There's the kind of 6 words, and that's all we've got, and they give us nothing apart from, I should always be okay. That's what you expect from me, isn't it? So this is a kind of emotional trap for a lot of young for a lot of boys and men, that they've learned, I should always be okay, I should not be needy, I should not have any wants. And so right there, it's quite, so even, and this is one of the questions we ask as we start our men's group, what do you need? It's a frightening question. What do I need? Me? I'm absolutely sorted, mate. So that takes us into that place of vulnerability. So in terms of things to do, I always say, look, we need to, it's about disciplines. It's about creating healthy habits, little habits. And I want trying to help men to stack habits on to already habits, so it's not like a burden. So one of the things I say, look, if we want to become more emotionally aware, we need to start having regular check-ins with ourselves, with our body and with ourselves. So that could be when we go to the toilet, ask ourselves a question. I've just had a text in the last hour. I could have had a conversation with a client. I could have had a memory pop into my head. I could have had a communication with my wife or my partner, and there's a possibility of getting loads of feelings there. Most of us, we just miss them. So I say, look, the more we check in with ourselves emotionally, is that so to make that normal. So tag that on to something. The other thing within that is absolutely listen to our body, start to connect to our body. What's going on in our body? Are we feeling tension in our shoulders? What's going on in our face? Kind of becoming a lot more attuned to that. And also face is really important, I think. So I think men, again, we've adopted a kind of poker face, that default resting face. So sometimes I say to men, look, when you go into the bathroom, look in the mirror. what's your face telling you? What's it telling everybody else? Is that being congruent? Does it match your inner world? And then in some of the groups I do, we'll actually, it's kind of fun, but it's kind of almost like childlike,
Yeah.
but we'll start moving our face. So we might pass a smile around. Like, it's like interesting, isn't it? Even on screen, you can probably see yourself. I can see myself. That's quite interesting. What do I look like? I found my default face in a rear view mirror of my car, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this is what people see when I'm at rest, And
Yeah.
so I'm trying to practice moving, and just because I think we do have this default face, and we just need to start moving it and expressing it, because we often hear from women, especially, I have no idea what he's thinking. I do not know what's going on inside of his head, because our faces don't move. We don't express ourselves. So we have to practice kind of reconnecting with the emotional world, emotional language. And another little thing, which I often say is that's kind of second part of my emotional fitness program, is vocab. We need more words. This is where the foreign language. So if we've only got those 6 words, okay, not bad, fine, all right, normal, we need to advance our vocab. So, and that means, I use a feeling wheel. We've got one in my book, in terms of, right, let's get more language. Let's practice that language. So I often say, take 3 feeling words off that feeling wheel, build them into your language for the day or for the week. So it sounds a bit weird to put on that feeling wheels in, but words in, but actually it's a bit like learn a foreign language. The more we try it, the more natural it becomes. So I think we have to do that kind of practice and work with that. And for me, kind of, it sounds boring, and it kind of is, but I think we need to work with that. The other thing I think in being with our body is, what have we learned about how to move emotions in our body? I know that when I get to certain places, I like moving, I like dancing, stuff like that. So I will, and music will move me. And I think there's really interesting to listen to, why is that music moving me? And does it move my body? And then is that a place to release those feelings? The same with films. When we're watching films, we might sit in a room, we might find tears streaming down our face. The emotional fitness is, well, what is that about? What happened there? A bit like me, I always talk about, kind of Billy Elliot, old film, but the thing is all about the relationship between the boy and the father.
Yes.
The way the father turned around and loved his son, and for me that just always will bring tears to my eyes and take me back to that relationship.
I love that thing of finding what works for you. And fun enough, last night at the dinner, I was talking about how much, and I spoke to it twice this week, how much I miss going to nightclubs. And
Right.
that would be a release. And I was very much a dancer. I wasn't a prop the bar up. Me and my mate
Yeah.
Tom, our rule was, and we were on a budget when we were young, so you knew how much it cost to get in. How much would 6 pints and a couple of shots be? The important stuff.
Yeah.
But from like 11 o'clock, we would be on the dance floor till 2, and that would be a emotional release, then physical release. And you realize, let's face it, for most men over, let's just say 35, they'll be like, well, when was the last time you went anywhere and danced, let alone at a nightclub?
Yeah. No,
And
definitely.
that can be one of those other things that I miss that. I've lost that. I don't know, that experience. But like you say, when you put music on, that can take you back to somewhere and just, I don't know, maybe get you out of your own head a little bit.
Exactly.
Now, I wanted to ask you, I'm always interested in talking to guys who've written books, because a lot of guys I know want to write a book. They don't always necessarily know, what it exactly going to be about. But not just, what was it like writing the book, and how long did it take you? Because I know for some people it flows out of them. Other people are like, do you know what? I had a block at some point. So what was the experience like for you?
Hard work. Really
You're
difficult.
honest.
Yeah, this is the second book. I started a book when my boys were quite young, and I think I wrote about 40,000 words. Just stopped. Couldn't do it anymore. Then so came back to it probably another 10 years after that to write the Secret Lives of Men. Now that took me probably at least 7 years to write. So there was a lot of stuff in there, and I think I needed it because of all the work that I was doing with men in groups and training and individually. So it was slow process. I think I could write another book a lot quicker. Although I say that I've been trying to write another book for a while, but it's just because I like writing,
Yeah.
but it's hard work.
Do you start off with it? Let's say if we pick The Secret Lives of Men as the book we're talking about, did you start off with I mean, firstly, some people get a book coach, or you have a complete framework, or was it kind of like, let's see what comes out of you? Because I know different people have found different ways of executing the same thing, basically.
Yeah, I think I just something that came out of me really. And that's why it took a lot longer, because I was writing this stuff and bits and chapters and stuff like that, or they didn't even have chapter headings, and then the wrong way around really, but I think it was the right way around for me. I kind of had got a structure, and then the actual finished structure did not come, it came a fair way behind the process. And then because I took it to editors and people, and I got feedback. And so before I think after the second edit, I think I then wrote the introduction, and then divided it into 3 parts, which it came together, and I was really pleased with the way it came together. But it took a long time of moving.
I think it's really good to hear, because it's a bit like social media. You can look at other people and what they're doing and what they achieve, or how much money they've got and how many views or what have you, and you realize that everybody has their own path, and some people can achieve things very quickly. And I think the other point is, some people outsource it, so they I've read some books where you realize that actually it was ghost written. So which is, in my view, cheating. But ultimately, if you produce a good book, you produce a good book. But if you're going to sit and do it yourself, that's one of the main things I hear from guys, is saying, not saying it's the most important thing, but they're like, I'd love to write a book. And I've been kind of, what's the word, jotting down the ideas of the book that I at some point will write, which will be Becoming a Whole Man. And that meaning, that's why it's really good to talk to you today, because it isn't just about morning routine, cold showers, and how much money you've got in the bank and how fit you are. It is your emotional intelligence, emotional fitness. But also I wanted for you, when you kind of even go one step higher, like spirituality and soul, and I just wondered where you sit on discussions on that, because again, it's some people completely believe in God, which is great. Other people think it's total rubbish. Other people aren't sure. And I just wonder where you are on that as well.
Well, that's a good question, and that takes me right back, because as a young boy, I started out in going to church. I was in the kind of very strong kind of evangelical wing of the church. And I was working after I finished sort of carpentry, I went into youth work, and most of that was in the church or in youth organizations, working in inner cities and doing detached youth work, all that kind of stuff, living in communities and stuff like that. So I mean, it's a big part of where I am. And I mean, part of what got me moving from that was that I kind of burnt out at that point. It was probably just early 30s, mid 30s. And then I went away to, and this is the only thing at that point in my life I could actually feel like I could do. I went away to live in a retreat place, a kind of Celtic spirituality, if you like, in the middle of Northumberland. And in the really out of the way. And it was then that I started to get quite deep into a different kind of spirituality, a lot more. And I like the kind of Celtic stuff, very earthy, very connected to the earth and environment and the past and stuff like that. So it's definitely part of my roots. I haven't, for the last 15 odd years, been involved in kind of church or stuff like that. It doesn't really. I think if I was to find the right place in terms of a kind of non-dogmatic, embracing spirituality, and certainly I think some of that's maybe outside the church. It makes a lot of sense to me. I'd probably call myself a trustful agnostic. So that embracing not knowing, and I think even embracing not knowing in my whole life is a real liberation. And like I don't have to, that sense of kind of letting go of ego, almost like, I'm not saying I have let go of all of ego, but the practice of the idea of that I don't need to prove anything, I don't need to be anything, I don't need to know, is such a liberating thing. So I think there's a lot of rich resources in spirituality. There's a lot of stuff also within man and masculinity that has come out of kind of the spiritual world as well.
It's a big topic, and the last two podcasts, we interviewed a guy called Jim Kyles, who I kept getting his name wrong accidentally because it's Jim and then an N on it, which I'd never seen before. So you just naturally type it wrong. But he was a pastor out in the States, so I found it really interesting to talk to him and Neil Kramer, who was the previous podcast, who spoke very much about his kind of journey of exploration of God and etc. And I realized, for me, until I was about 40, quite frankly, I just wasn't interested. Whereas now I'm at that age where you're like, once you have kids, or for me, I'm like, what do I tell them? What do I teach them? Because if I don't know myself, and it's okay to say I don't know, but it's funny how it makes you reflect. A bit like you said, looking in the mirror at your own face. And you're like, what is the truth? What is and the other thing I was going to say is, what I liked about your book is, I think for guys, they need, like you said, practical tips and advice. You can get highly expansive on different things. I've read some books where I read it and I'm like, I don't really understand how the average man is going to implement this stuff. But for you, it's the practical tips. And the last question I was going to ask you, I know we're coming up to our kind of hour-ish time, but who are the men who you've either read or looked up to or followed, be it in the last few years or in the last 20, 30 years? I'm always interested to hear, because sometimes it's people I've never heard of.
Yeah, so great. So who are the books? I'm just looking, I've got my bookshelf here. Right. I've got loads of books on masculinity. So I think one of the key guys for me was a chap called Terence Real. He's written lots of books on relationships, actually, but I think his first book was I Don't Want to Talk About It. And it's
right.
I'm just going to get off here. What's the subtitle? Overcoming the Secret Legacy of Male Depression. Really full book, really powerful book. And I think a lot of the other books, I've got a book in terms of the men's circle or circle of men's groups, guy called Bill Kauth. He was the kind of almost seen as the godfather of men's groups, and he's basically got a book that is really practical and useful in terms of all of that kind of stuff. And the other book that is written, which was one of my key books in terms of masculinity, is called The Will to Change, not by a man, but by Bell Hooks. And she's she's unfortunately died a couple of years ago, but she's a feminist. And I think it's a really interesting book coming from that perspective. And this book is a beautiful book in terms of the way she wants and describes men and masculinity in a relationship with her father. So that, for me, actually was a really instinctive in hearing from a woman about men and their love for men as well.
I think it's really interesting, firstly, because there's like a new wave of, let's say, men who, let's use Jordan Peterson, for example. I know a lot of men that really enjoy his content. He cries a bit too much on screen, as if, for me, I'm always wondering where, I always wonder if people get promoted very, very highly on social media, do they get pushed by someone, or is it just organic? But what I loved you just said is 3 people I've never heard of. So it's refreshing to have people that I'm always looking to try. And when guys ask me, I don't want to just say the normal, and because guys go, yeah, I've heard that. So to have 3 new ones for me is kind of like you've unearthed something. I always add it to I've got a long list of different books, and yours is on there of, when guys say, well, where should I start? I'm like, well, look, there's no necessarily starting, but why don't you pick these 3 books, ask them for your birthday, and work through them from there. But brilliant. And I love talking to you because I think it's so interesting. And for guys to just, hopefully we've given, especially you've given guys just something to think about, that being strong and silent isn't the way. If they want to be, that's fine. But, our events were built on the joy of getting guys together to talk. And it doesn't have to be that you're weeping on each other's shoulder. It's like just saying, like you said, what can I do for you, or what do you need? And you just be like, do you know what, things are a bit shit at the moment, and people go, oh yeah, I'm going through that. So, oh, you as well. Oh wow. So
that,
it's
and just to jump in there, that is the most important thing I think about getting men together. The sense of breaking this kind of not kind of normalization idea that actually when men are together, they can talk, they will talk, and they can be vulnerable, and that it's contagious. And it's like, exactly as you said, one man can say something, oh, what, you as well? You know, and that's such a liberating thing of that kind of normalization process, and that takes men out of their isolation. So massively important stuff, that.
I really appreciate you coming on, because again, now we're up to, I mean, this will be the last podcast before Christmas. This will go out on the 23rd of December. So
Okay.
for some men, I'm lucky that we'll have a Christmas surrounded by family, and quite frankly, you'll be knackered by the end of it. But for some men, if you haven't got a partner, or maybe you're spreading family that you fucking hate, know some men that are like, yeah, I'm with, especially if they've got, what's the word? Maybe they're divorced and they're with a different family or something like that. So it's a reminder for guys that, even at festive times, even if you can find a book or a podcast or something that you can, I hate to use the word escape, but you can listen to, that just gets you, I don't know, your mind in the right, your mind in the right frame, if that's the right saying. How's the best way if a guy wants to read a book? I guess I hate to say Amazon, but would it be to go to a website or?
Yeah, well, yes, Amazon is, unfortunately, you can get my book off other websites, but Amazon is the key one. And I'd just like to say here also, I have made an audio version, and I'm hoping it's going to be released the 1st of December, or around there. So, because I know that a lot of people read my book, a lot of women read my book, and I know that men listen to books. So I'm hoping this will be another way, and that book will be available on Amazon, but also the Author Republic. So it's a bit more of an independent. So yeah.
That's great. And funny enough, on that point, I haven't checked recently, but the last time I looked, I think 25% of our podcast listeners are female.
Yeah.
Which is funny, because it's men talking to men about men's stuff, and it makes you realize there's a huge demand from women to just understand what is going on in a man's head, and we don't know either. So good.
Well, that's exactly it. But that's that's the part of the reason I wrote my book, because I know we've run out of time.
No, it's all right.
But there's stuff about before I wrote my book, I put on a couple of workshops, or open events that were free. One was basically 10 tips how to understand men. That was for women, and they were generally full. 10 tips on how they will do the work, women, I think, actually, for men. Often women will ring me up, want to send their husband to me or stuff like that. I then equally put on a kind of an MOT for men, and no man turned up. So the book, really, I know that women will read the book and get the book into hopefully on the coffee table or something. And as you know, I've written the book in terms of it's fairly big, it's lots of boxes and stuff like that, so you can flick through it, you can start. And I'm kind of hoping that if you can get it into the hands of men, then they don't have to read it all, just read a little bit, because that is the way the book is meant to be, really.
I laugh because you beautifully touched on a point which I always say one of the hardest things for the Whole Man Academy was getting bums on seats, being men, because often I had women saying, I love your idea, I wish you did a women's one, I'd come with Jane and Claire and Sue and whoever, whereas the men would generally come on their own. And the only event where we then had groups was we had I don't know if you know who David Gandy is, but he's our ambassador, and he's I think he's been on more front covers than any man in the world, because he's a style icon. So when he spoke at one of our events at Geeves and Hawks on Savile Row, we had 65 guys in the room, which was really good. And that was the only event where you saw 5 guys all came together. And the important point here is, and hopefully you see where I'm going with this, I want the Whole Man Academy events to be a aspirational experience, not I'm going to an event and I don't tell people. I want people to be like, hey, I'm going to this great event where James Hawes is speaking, and this person and this guy and this guy. It was great, and I'm getting dressed up for it, as opposed to I'm going to an Ibis hotel with shitty carpet and we're going to sit around and so it's
that's great. You're talking about breaking the stigma, and I think absolutely, if we can just make this natural, normal stuff, this is what we as men do. No shame in it. Absolutely, that's right off my hymn sheet. The idea of if we can break this stigma that, and I suppose that's why I talk about, look, we'll equally talk about physical fitness, but if we can just like emotional fitness, you're feeling every moment of every day. Why wouldn't you want to exercise those emotions and get to know those emotions? But because the stigma is still there. But if what you're doing and the great work you're doing and the idea of, look, this is what we as men do. This is just normal stuff. Fantastic.
That's one of the biggest things I've only ever found one person that didn't quite get, and I appreciate they didn't understand what I was trying to do because maybe I didn't put it across. But that's why bringing in a mixture of guys like yourself who maybe can have let's call it a clinical viewpoint, but then having special forces guys, footballers, cryptocurrency experts, entrepreneurs, all these different guys to make you realize that everybody has challenges and they're going to keep throwing them at you left, right and center. Sure. And it is kind of, it's up to you. How do you deal with it has been one of the big messages. But well, look, I appreciate your time. I always say this at the end because we're not too far away from each other. So hopefully at some point we will meet either at an event or something in London or something like that, because
no, I love that. That'd be great.
I think it's important for us guys to not just connect but stay connected, and promote each other's messages, which is always helpful. So I will let you go. I appreciate your time and I will speak to you soon, James.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for having me on. I've really enjoyed it.
Lovely. Thank you, mate. Cheers.
Thanks for listening. Remember to sign up to our game-changing weekly e-letter that's read by men around the world. Sign up at wholemanacademy.com/movement. Until next time.